We are back at Infowars.com. California Dreamin' today. That is, if you're a Ron Paul supporter, still celebrating his 44% victory in the California straw poll over the weekend. On the line with us now is Lew Rockwell, editor of aaron-dykes.com, one of the best alternative news sites anywhere on the web, boiling everything down. And are you there with us now, Lew?
I sure am, Aaron. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks very much for joining us. So out of the gates, what is your response to Ron Paul's significant straw poll victory over the weekend, other progress he's been making, and where the campaign is headed?
Well, I thought you have a very good article up today on your webpage about how Texas just very conveniently canceled its straw poll because they said there was no interest in it. But, of course, as you point out, it was to prevent Perry from being embarrassed by having Ron smack him over the head in the state of which he's governor. And I think that's typical of what's happening with Ron. Of course, the establishment wants to hide things. This is a terrible thing to admit, but I look at Politico every day, the Politico site, which is a very regime, of course, establishment site. And I was just interested this week in when would they report Ron's amazing victory in the California straw poll. And again, this is a victory, among people who were all officials. These were not students or whatever. And he smashed the other candidates, Perry, Romney, Bachmann, they brought in Bachmann as the keynoter, and they were very, very cold and standoffish to Ron. None of the officials, with the exception of one, went to any of his receptions, or they of course, didn't want him there, and yet he won overwhelmingly. So I was interested in when would Politico, which is the key D.C. political site, when would they report it? It wasn't reported on Saturday, wasn't reported on Sunday. Last night I noticed that under an article that said something like why California is going to be electorally insignificant because it's the date of the primary or whatever. There was a little tiny sub-hit, a micro sub-hit under there about Ron winning the California primary. On this same page, they still had a major headline about Santorum having won the Pennsylvania straw poll, his home state, of course, a week ago. So they still had that up a week later, and they just put, so that's typical. But, I think it hurts them. It doesn't hurt Ron, because all his people know, first of all, nobody who's a Ron Paul supporter is going to Politico to find out what's going on. We just want to see maybe what the establishment is saying, but we're typically not looking for news. But I think the whole blackout of Ron, all that stuff rebounded on them, hurt them, because, of course, no regular American trusts the mainstream media. I don't care what your political orientation is, or even if you don't have a political orientation. We all have just an instinctual dislike of the networks, the three government networks that were set up, after World War II, and the rest of the mainstream media. We know that they're a bunch of liars and stenographers for the government. So the fact that they don't like Ron Paul is actually a good thing, because it just stimulates his followers, stimulates his donors. He just raised another $1 million this weekend from regular Americans' average donation of about $56, and that's the way his fundraising goes. Regular people support him. It's not the Warren Buffetts of the world. In fact, they of course want to do anything they can to prevent Ron Paul from doing well. But he is doing well. He's doing, he keeps moving up in the polls, and I always think, even though I'm fascinated by the polls, I always like to put in my political blog on aaron-dykes.com. I always like to report what the polls say, but I'm also aware that you can't really trust the polls. And one thing that always sticks in my head is that in the run-up to World War II, well, we now know that both Gallup and the other major polls cooperated with the Roosevelt administration to fake their results, so that it seemed like gradually, over time, more and more Americans were forgetting into World War II. In fact, that was a lie. Virtually nobody was forgetting into World War II until, of course, Roosevelt's event at Pearl Harbor happened. So sometimes pollsters in cahoots with the government lie. So is that happening now? I don't know, but it's always sort of niggling in the back of my head. But even among these polls, Ron is doing better and better. He, of course, they keep trying to say he's not top tier, and Bachmann and Huntsman are top tier. Bachmann, who's way below Ron, maybe getting half his support, according to these polls. And Huntsman, of course, who barely, registers a pulse on these polls, just because he's the son of a billionaire and he's a establishment guy, he's considered top tier. But they can't, all that kind of description of calling Ron not in the top tier just outrages his supporters, makes them want to work harder, and doesn't have any effect against him. So it's quite extraordinary. He comes in, of course, third even in these polls, the national and state level polls. Quite exciting to see. It's like all the work he did 4 years ago, and of course all the work he's been doing for decades in speaking out against the banksters and big government and the wars and all the rest of the depredations that Washington, D.C. visits on us. He's built up a huge amount of credibility. I don't think there's ever been anybody in American politics like Ron Paul, maybe politics anywhere like Ron Paul. So he has this huge credibility. He's sort of the opposite of the MSM or any other politician. People actually believe him. They actually believe he speaks the truth, and of course he does speak the truth. He always speaks his mind, and everybody loves that. So it's
well, he predicted all of this economic stuff coming down, even to the point where it would bolster his own popularity in 2012 race. And now we see the Federal Reserve emerging as a serious issue. They asked about it at the CNN debates. Some of the candidates said, yeah, they would audit it, but they kind of wouldn't even consider reforming the system itself. Meanwhile, the beast is totally unleashed. It's consuming Europe through the bailout process and all the rest of it. There's no sign of stopping. How significant is it that the Federal Reserve has become a well-known term to the American public and that it's becoming a campaign issue?
Aaron, astounding. I've been interested in the Fed for a very long time. I can remember writing and talking about it in the 1960s. And I can tell you, nobody was interested. Economists were interested. Nobody else was interested. Their eyes would glaze over. Ron Paul, building on the great Austrian economists, Mises and Rothbard, Senholz, Hayek, and so forth, has made this a popular issue. And of course, as Rothbard always liked to point out, it's not enough to explain economic error. You also have to show that they're ripping you off. So that's what Ron Paul has done with the Fed. He's made Americans understand this is not just a mistake some institution in Washington is making. They are ripping off the average person, not only here but around the world, for the benefit of the big banks. Everything that's happening in Europe, and of course now it's open that the Fed is going to bail out the European banks and the European governments, which are in hock to the banks. Everything happening in Europe has to do with the banks, just like it does here. We all live in a bankocracy. So Ron Paul has made that an issue, and of course, once people begin to understand that this is morally no different from a counterfeiting operation, only far more damaging than a local counterfeiting operation, realize that this is really a criminal enterprise set up by the big banks back in 1910. The Rockefellers, the Morgans, and so forth. They wrote the Federal Reserve Act, and it was passed under the evil Woodrow Wilson, and has caused endless trouble. When Ron Paul first decided to become a public figure and to give up his very successful medical practice, it was Nixon's closing of the gold window, which was the cutting of the final tie between the dollar and gold. Since that time, the Federal Reserve has been 100% a discretionary institution. They just print as much money as they want. There's no limit on them. And as Ron said right then, he said, this is going to make sure that average Americans are not going to see, their standard of living is going to be harmed for the benefit of the big interests. And, of course, that's exactly what happened. In fact, really the average American family has not seen an increase in its standard of living since Nixon did that. Yes, we have wonderful gadgets. We have the Internet, we have our computers and iPads and all the iPods. I love all that stuff myself. But the average family's standard of living has not improved. I don't care what the government statistics are in terms of what you actually have after taxes in the current dollars to spend on your family, to put away for savings or whatever else. It's no different than it was in the early 1970s. That is a criminal act, and of course it's an act of theft. This is not just a mistake. It's a theft, a gigantic theft, the biggest theft in the history of the world, as a matter of fact, engineered by the Federal Reserve for the big banks and for the government and for the other big government contractors, also the military-industrial complex, the medical-industrial complex, big pharma, and so forth. All these people, of course, are all on the gravy train. They're all feeding at the trough. While the average guy is being strangled and forced to give up his few bucks to feed to these people. So Ron Paul has made this a tremendous issue, and I'll never forget more than 4 years ago when he spoke at the University of Michigan after the Michigan debate when he said what was coming economically, that we were entering a very serious recession. Indeed, had already entered it. All the other Republican candidates, McCain and all the rest of these creeps, said, "Well, that's ridiculous," Huckabee and so forth. "That's ridiculous. Bush is great. The economy is great. How dare you, take a Democratic line, which was their line, and criticize our wonderful president and his management of the economy." So after this, Ron went to the University of Michigan, a very liberal campus, and he spoke to 4,000 students, came out into the quad to hear him. And very unusual for college students to come out and hear somebody. 4,000 kids, and as he's speaking to them, and they're cheering him about foreign policy and everything, but when he started talking about money and the central bank, these kids started chanting, "End the Fed, end the Fed, end the Fed." And that's where Ron got that slogan, came from the students. And some of them started holding up dollar bills that they had lit on fire as if to give a message to Bernanke. And it was a great, it was a tremendous moment, I believe a moment that will be looked back upon by future historians as a real turning point in this country.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then we have Rick Perry writing a book, also picking up on the Fed slogan, "Fed up" rather than "end the Fed," and other things. It's really strange to see how they try to co-opt Ron, even as he has complete success with the people. But the other thing is, I caught most of his speech from the California straw poll, and he's not only talking about money and ending the Federal Reserve, but tying it all into a natural rights issue, along with police shutting down lemonade stands, along with police not allowing people to sell raw eggs or raw milk and so forth. Where do you see things going on that front?
Well, of course, Ron always talks about how freedom unites us, because maybe we don't agree with the next guy on every point, but we want freedom for the issues we care about. And so there are people who care about healthy food, and they care about being able to have raw milk and have access to something other than foods that are manufactured by the big companies in league with the federal government. And these sometimes people are not libertarians, although I think that they're increasingly becoming libertarians. But so Ron Paul attracts the support of everybody, whether they're quote left or quote right, because we all want freedom. And as he says, it unites us. So I think the food issue is extremely important. When that, when there was a recent, and of course you guys reported on this too, when there was a recent SWAT team attack on an Amish farmer for selling raw milk to willing buyers. That's something out of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And in fact, of course, already we live in a fascist state in this country. We've had a fascist economy of at least a Mussolini sort, really ever since Franklin Roosevelt. Socialism was really never the danger here. Fascism has been the danger. And of course, we live under a fascist government of big corporations and big government ruling the rest of us and in cahoots ripping us off.
Well, they built up a big government system and then rerouting the beneficiaries straight to Wall Street and the rest of the corporations.
Well,